This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Kevin Holt, who teaches in the Department of Music at Stony Brook University. His research blends historical study, cultural studies, and the place of hip-hop in contemporary race, politics, and identity discourse. In this conversation, we discuss the importance of musicological research in Black studies, the expansive meaning and significance of hip-hop, and the place of local and regional history in cultural studies. Good morning, Kevin. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am fantastic. As I was saying right before we got started, before I hit record, I'm in this really great moment of I have not yet reckoned with my summer responsibilities as a professional, but I also turned in my grades a few weeks ago, so I'm in this really great place and doing the thing that I really wanted to be doing, which is having conversations about the field of Black studies. So really happy that you made the time and we're going to have a chance to talk today for a number of reasons. First of all, I think your research is extremely interesting. I think it's really relevant and urgent for the field of Black studies. So getting your voice that way on the podcast is really important. I know your book's coming out soon, so congratulations in advance about that. Big deal.
Thank you.
And also I wanted to say, one of the things that I think is really neglected in the field of Black studies is musicology, which is really tragic given the importance of music and expressive culture in the Black intellectual tradition. But musicology is really underrepresented in the field, and you'll contribute to a really small but hopefully growing wing of musicologists in Black studies. I have Stephanie Shonikin and Kira Gaunt and a couple others. And so really happy to have you contributing to that part of the series, which is a long way of saying, Kevin, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I look forward to talking.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for that really gracious introduction. It's, I agree. There's so much about histories of Black music that are so important to how we have oriented ourselves and that are so intentional. And sometimes that kind of falls away in conversation, right? Music comes in as a metaphor or as some other type of representation of things that are happening, but not necessarily a focus of there were very intentional decisions made in the creation of this music, and it's doing very specific work. So, again, my long way of saying, I love to be kind of at the nexus of those two conversations because I think it really does add something important to both Black studies and musicology.
Great. No, I'm really looking forward to this. I mean, just autobiographically, when I was in graduate school at University of Memphis in philosophy, I had wanted to switch to do musicology at University of Mississippi at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. This was in the early mid-90s. And I remember my sort of person who was facilitating this or sort of encouraging this was David Evans, who's a historian of Delta blues music and North Mississippi music. And he was like, you gotta improve as a player. Because I was just a sort of hack away and play. And he was like, in the end, he was like, well, you're making a big decision because you're not a good enough player, right? And you don't know the theory and the music and the composition stuff that's so important to understanding this. And I didn't quit, but I was like, oh, there's like a bigger thing at stake in musicology than maybe I thought. I thought it was a little bit more like philosophers thinking about music and music as a metaphor and example. I think there's so much that's interesting, and I love doing that work myself. But the musicology angle is just really, really different. So, you all doing special work, and Black Studies needs it very badly. I will say that. Well, we'll have a chance to talk about your research, hear a little bit about your critical approaches and how you think about the field of Black studies and the relationship between those. But I was interested, before we get into that, to hear you talk a little bit in a more personal register about what drew you to Black studies, what drew you to the study of Black life, and what keeps you connected to this kind of work and sustains you.
Well, I think it's important for me to start off acknowledging that I did not necessarily see scholarship for my future, in the beginning,
Mhm.
I started out as a performing musician, and, there are probably very many musicians out there who are like, who can relate to the idea of, I'm going to learn my instruments, I'm going to play the song, I'm never going to read a book, like, and that's kind of what I was gearing up for. um, so my entry into Black studies was, in some ways, very personal at the beginning. So, again, I'm at Oberlin Conservatory at the time. I'm really focusing on performance, doing a lot of performance oriented things, and a couple of things kind of happened. Right, the first is I lost my father. So my father passed uh, during my undergraduate experience, and I felt this lingering sense of, there are so many questions that I won't be able to ask. So many things that won't get direct answers. And while I knew that I couldn't necessarily, ask my father these questions, I could create knowledge around the experience of, somebody of his generation navigating, Columbus, Georgia at a certain time. I could sort of expand in that way. So really, that's one of the things that kind of drew me to Black studies. It was really kind of this personal framing. And then the second thing that happened uh, was I was really thinking about ways to expand my influence as a musician, right? I was thinking, if I'm doing this musician thing, at some point somebody's going to ask me something, and I want something smart to say.
I like that.
So no, but yeah, it really kind of started there, but it kind of grew into love. I think even when I started Black Studies, I didn't fully realize um, the depth of how it would speak to me,
Mhm.
and the impact that I see it happening in the world and in my personal experience. So it really grew from there, and even continuing. So while I was at Oberlin, did the Bachelor of Music, but decided to do a double degree program. So I expanded to Africana Studies. Um, then for a while, I was a gigging musician. So I was kind of performing around. I joined a band. I was playing with a symphony, and I honestly I applied in grad school on a whim. It was
Nice.
one of many possible directions forward, and I had really not a good sense of what type of candidate I was, but I was like, I have some thoughts, I have some ideas. I'm gonna go for it. Oh, this actually speaks to something much earlier, and this is, forgive the anecdote.
That's I love the anecdote, so
Yeah, yeah, no, years earlier, this was back when I was a high school student. I had, we were doing Black history projects.
Mhm.
And I decided that my Black history project would be on African American classical composers. And I worked really hard on that project. And I found through it that a lot of people that I encountered in this research went to Columbia. A lot of these composers, coming to mind, Undine Smith Moore. She was at the Teachers College, but went to Columbia. And so, in the back of my mind, when I was thinking about places to apply to for grad school, I was like, I should apply to Columbia because there's this history that's already there. Uh, Not to stray too far from the anecdote, but uh, one of the things that also sticks out to me about that was the teacher that year docked me a letter grade because, and I quote, "Black people making classical music isn't real Black history." So
That's wild.
that was another kind of orienting thing, you
It This
know.
is history, it's a thing that happened. Okay.
Right? It's like,
I don't know
oh
what to
yeah,
say
like
about that.
wild take. Yeah, I wish I had the kind of orientation and bravery to challenge that harder,
Yeah, of
but
course.
but now I do. So if I ever see him in the street, but yeah, so that led me to Columbia. I applied, I got in to at the time it was the Institute for Research in African American Studies, uh, or no, the Institute for Research in African Diasporic Studies, IRIS, and it's since become a department,
Mhm.
and it's now African American African Diasporic Studies. Um, but yeah, even while I was there, I didn't have the clearest vision, and certainly in the beginning, about how exactly I would merge my musicianship to my scholarship. And I had the privilege of, working with the amazing faculty there, being mentored by some amazing faculty, but also there were a lot of visiting faculty at that point. So I also got to spend time with Greg Tate, who was on a fellowship there at the time. Got to spend some time with Monica R. Miller and Carla Shedd, like these really, and Daphne Brooks, right? These folks who really showed me that if you want to engage something like music, especially popular music, seriously, then there is a strong foundation of theory that you need. Like this is a
Mhm.
way to think about music as making a scholarly intervention, and that actually kind of led me to ethnomusicology, right? Because I was able to kind of merge a lot of the theory that I encountered in Black studies to my interests in looking very closely at music to analyze it, but also sort of socio-historically looking at music. Um, and so that's kind of where I've seen myself, right? I've always seen myself as kind of in both, having
Uh-huh.
um, musical conversations in Black studies and having uh, Black studies theory uh, and theory kind of oriented conversations within musicology.
I love that. I especially love this, at some point somebody's gonna ask me something and I need something to say. That's
Right.
it's funny when you said that, it gave a language for a couple of really formative experiences I had as a young person. I was like, "If I'm gonna be this or pretend like I'm this, I need to have something to say." That's a great motivator. It's like pride that leads you to insight.
Right.
But,
Right.
and I mean, really, but, more substantially, I really love this the way you wrap that up in terms of having Black studies conversations in musicology and musicology conversations in Black studies. I think it's that kind of transgressive character of Black studies that is so interesting and so productive, and in that way is insurgent across disciplines in so many ways, because it
Right.
asks different questions, has different approaches and critical frames. But returning musicological questions to Black studies is absolutely essential also to shaping and reshaping the field as it evolves. And sort of in that mode, right? I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about your portrait of Black studies. And I think about this in terms of the founding of the field, which had
Mm,
a tension built into it. One, a commitment to the intellectual tradition that came from student demands, where students were saying, traditional disciplines have not given us a rigorous, expansive, deep study of Black life, if it's studied it at all. If traditional disciplines have done this work at all, Black studies is going to be that place where we can do that work, and we inherit that really today in the commitment of Black studies to an intellectual tradition. But of course, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, this is a moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where some of these boundaries between intellectual life and political life, between campuses and communities, between ideas and prescriptive action and political mobilization, those lines had really gotten blurred and really gotten contested. Their
mhm.
legitimacy, and I think we inherit that today in terms of the political imperatives of Black studies, commitment to a certain kind of liberatory politics. And
Mhm.
I never want to call it a contradiction. But I think it is a real tension between two commitments, one political and one intellectual. And sort of couching it in those terms, I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you imagine the field of Black studies. What's that portrait that orients you as a scholar?
Mm. Yeah, I love the framing there, like the kind of twin impact of we have advocacy and we have intellectual traditions. I think that's kind of the superpower, though, because s- we are on the other side of several centuries of creating race and creating certain orientations around blackness and whiteness that impact us on the macro level and on the micro level.
Mm,
And so that creates a situation where people whose experiences are marked by blackness are they're set apart in certain ways. They have a different perspective, and you know the the marginalizing, the eschewing, the negation of those perspectives perpetuate so much more than just anti-blackness. It perpetuates a certain type of worldview, a skewing of the worldview. So, in many ways, the advocacy, kind of it pushes us to pay attention to those marginal experiences in a way that you know, that pushes back against the skew. It's that advocacy that allows for, a closer strive toward objectivity or as close to objectivity as our subjectivities can muster. Um, so, I find something really, really important about being able to orient around those experiences and around those histories and understanding it as ongoing and evolving work, right? Because there is always sort of a new idea or a new framing in the contemporary construction of blackness and orientation, as it orients, you know, uh, toward or against whiteness.
mhm.
So yeah, that is work that I see within the field. And for that reason, I love how much we lean into the interdisciplinarity of Black studies, because there is collectively, we kind of create so many kinds of interventions that are so necessary for so many different areas, right?
Mhm.
It's that perspective, it's that sort of theoretical kind of reorientation, right? That leads toward a more thoughtful take on the taken for granted truths, the common sense narratives, and that is something that's beneficial, really for any discipline that is privileged enough to be one of the interdisciplinary sort of nexus of Black studies.
Mhm. I love that. I mean, the way you described, especially there at the end, the meaning of interdisciplinarity is so interesting to me because I think there's a tendency to think interdisciplinary is in Black studies, multiple disciplines converge to address Black studies questions, right?
Mhm.
But I like that this insistence that it's not just an interdisciplinarity for us, it's also an interdisciplinarity for everybody else because there's a movement out of there, right? Also
Right,
out of Black
right.
studies. And I mean, I think I've been thinking a lot lately about fields that I think have been really impacted by Black studies, namely history and English. And I think
Mhm.
both of those disciplines, there's such a wing, especially if it's concerned with Black literature, Black history. Those wings and those disciplines have become so multidisciplinary. I think Black studies has to take credit for that because that's the multidisciplinarity is also an insurgent move inside traditional disciplines that are
Right, right.
that Black studies scholars are able to do and demands and pressures put on those fields. And you really articulated that well, both in response to both these questions. So thank you for that. And
Uh,
so picking up on that, I'm also interested in your work, that you're a musicologist, but work with a range of expressive sites and traditions. You're interested in cultural studies and political analysis. And thinking about your work in the context of the field of Black studies, I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you think it fits in the past of the field, but
Mm,
also what boundaries you think it pushes or what new horizons you think it opens up.
okay. Yeah, thank you for this question. It really, it's one that made me think. Because I think, when we are engaged in our own scholarship, we have kind of natural inclinations. We have people that we go to, but sometimes, we can kind of breeze past, well, what legacy am I a part of? How do I see myself in relationship to the field that I am positioned, within one of the fields, right? So to start off with, there has always been a very interesting musical conversation within Black studies. There's a reason why in The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois, he punctuates every chapter with music and he ends the book with honestly a musicological analysis of the significance of the spiritual. That to me kind of signals that this stuff of theorizing blackness, for with an orientation toward the future, right? An idea of what this mix of theory and advocacy could be, has always included some discussion about music. Has always insisted that music is one of the means through which Black people have had to not had to, but, one of the ways that Black people have expressed. And this is, doubly significant because if we're talking about histories of people who have not been able to express openly, people who have not been able to uh, articulate the realities of their experiences in a straightforward way, during the time of enslavement and after, because of the stakes placed uh, on white comfort and Black oppression, right? Music becomes one of the ways that it is it's just set apart enough from direct communication, right? From something where there is an absolute kind of semiotic, meaning set to it. Just set enough apart that it becomes a really important means for expressing subversion, right? So music has always kind of been there. It's always been doing really important work. And I'm, thinking about that general area, that era, Zora Neale Hurston. you know, I, I always find myself kind of returning to Zora Neale Hurston because so much about what uh, she offered in terms of aesthetic theory, talking about angularity, um, talking about the practices that she observed in the rural South. It is so kind of prophetic, for a conversation, for instance, about the significance of timbre in something that is very significant to understanding music, the quality of sounds. But Western music traditionally kind of focuses on harmony, rhythm, and melody. Timbre is somewhere underneath, right?
Mhm.
So the idea of being able to put so much meaning in the timbre and the way that people are changing their voices and the layering the different kinds of sounds together to create something distinct. If we think of that as somebody, as a means of actually making commentary, as a means of actually sort of engaging or insisting upon, certain traditions that could not be expressed in the open. You know, music is right there. Um, and so we have that sort of angle on, theoretical orientations within Black music, Black studies, right? There have always been people who have taken seriously the stuff um, of Black art. But we also have histories of musicologists who insisted on discussing Blackness. Folks like Eileen Southern, Ollie Wilson, Portia K. Maltby, George Lewis, Samuel A. Floyd. All these people um, within a musicological field that didn't necessarily take Blackness too seriously, Black people and their music as seriously. Uh, they made such important interventions in sort of theorizing, and by theorizing Black music in the way that they did, this is the folks I just mentioned. Um, this is work that's happening in the 1960s and 1970s, and then sort of leads up through the 90s. But they're writing and working during a time where the general belief was that Black music was kind of disconnected or not thoughtful. Um, Even many of the people who appreciated it kind of saw it like bird song, right? It might be beautiful and complex, but we don't think the bird is a genius, right? Um, so they did so much to outline the intentionality of Black compositions, and to discuss the beauty of Black musical worlds, and very, very importantly, to highlight the philosophical approaches to music making that existed in Black communities, and that shifted the musicological discourse away from imagining Black music as something that just sort of happens, or something that is, mostly Western, but, it's a failed attempt at recreating certain Western aesthetics. Um, that is such an important kind of reorientation. And so when I think about the connections to my own work, that brought up my own sort of reorientation. As I mentioned, I was uh, at Columbia in grad school. I was I was working as a musician sort of on the side a little bit at that point. And I was taking in a lot of courses that were discussing, hip hop and music. And I encountered a lot of work that was, let's say, catastrophizing about the potential impact of Atlanta hip hop on the rest of hip hop culture.
Mhm.
And I get that in certain ways. I think at the time, I just wanted to explain that when we're talking about crunk music, when we're talking about, Atlanta hip hop party music, we're talking about music that's oriented around a different history than, let's say, the hip hop that emerged from, the Bronx in the 1970s. We're talking about a different sort of spatial history and a different sort of musical practice. So that really was the beginnings of what would eventually become my book. I I think, and I don't want to disparage, the work that was coming out before, because there were lots of reasons why um, most hip hop studies work at the time focused on poetry. Right, it was important to assert this music as valid, you know,
Sure.
and to connect it um, to oral histories, oral traditions. And it was important to discuss hip hop through a frame of its social political intervention. All of that is very important, but what I felt was missing at the time was a discussion of sound. And if we're not really engaging the sound seriously, then we lose the impact of things like chant, right? Music that's built around collective voicing, because collective voicing can't be too complex. It can't give you poetic virtuosity if the point is for us to voice together. So, uh, so again, this is just this is a way that the discourse was trending, um, and I just was like, well, I have some orientation here. Also, not for nothing, grew up in Atlanta, listened to a lot of Atlanta hip hop, and I had a different frame of reference.
Mhm.
So, so that kind of became a thesis, which eventually became a dissertation, which eventually became a book. And I think, the more of that sort of work, that sort of history that I've been able to engage, that I've been able to do, the more, or the clearer that sort of intervention has become. And again, if we're talking about historical orientations, I think there's so much about, again, returning to Zora Neale Hurston, her insistence that um, we have to bring focus onto Black vernacular traditions that are separate from attempts to depict modernity. I'm not saying that those those theories are without their concerns,
Mhm.
you know, because there was absolutely a dismissal of lots of kinds of blackness from Hurston. Um, but in those moments when we are hyper focused on certain frames as we build Black futures. And they are frames that allow us to sort of dismiss or bypass something that is apparently very important to a lot of people, something that people are connecting to, then being able to spend time with those people and try to understand, what is this music doing for you? What work is it doing? That that puts us in a better position than well, this is again just me talking, but it puts us in a better position than if we sort of dismiss or catastrophize. That is the reorienting question.
Mm.
Not how can we make them do something that we think that they should be doing, but why is this a decision that is recurring? What is drawing these people? In the case of Crunk, um, and something that I've been arguing throughout, there's something cathartic in that collective gesture that was necessary for the time,
Mhm.
that spoke to a lot of people in a lot of different circumstances, in a way that was not necessarily served by more passive listening experiences, or not necessarily served by um, a type of audienceship or engagement where I take in the poetic virtuosity of a singular performer.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and you've spoken to this a bit, but I just want to follow up with a, um, a sort of characterization, self-characterization question, because, you know, you really drew in so many different ways of thinking about this research topic or site or however you want to describe it. And I'm interested how you think that your movement, your PhD was in musicology, but you have, as you said, a BA and MA in Black Studies. I'm interested in how that movement across discipline and non-discipline has shaped how you conceive a research project, right?
Mm.
And that's because, that is two very different directions to go. I mean, musicology, especially ethnomusicology, has a kind of multidisciplinary dimension to it, but also a discipline. It has its own methods and approaches and canonical or traditional knowledge. And then Black Studies is its own thing. And sort of working between these two, I'm curious how you see it shaping how you imagine a question, how you conceive a research project, and how you execute it.
Mm. Yeah, I think probably the most kind of orienting thing, or the thing that bubbles up for me the most here, is the acknowledgement that these are disciplines that require different interventions. often with the same question, so within, within Black studies spaces, I have occasionally encountered folks who are resistant to the idea of paying that sort of close attention to music. Sometimes my sense is that it's around the utility of maintaining the mysticism of Black music, right?
Uh,
It is, it's a transcendent thing, and if we start breaking down its chords, suddenly it becomes something else.
uh-huh.
Um, so, and then even, sometimes just, the focus on sound doesn't necessarily register to everybody
Uh-huh.
as super significant. In my mind, the sound is very tied to everything else. Anybody who creates music, not just in Black musical traditions, but especially in Black musical traditions, they are very intentional about those sounds.
Yeah.
We know when something's off.
Mhm.
And tapping into that why or that how, often leads to questions about other ways that um, perspectives that have kind of marinated in Black experiences are driving, sort of philosophical and spatial and social, concerns.
Uh-huh.
So, that's kind of up in the air, or, one of the things that, when I am writing, I have to keep that in mind a little bit. And, within the space of musicology, you will sometimes, yeah, I still encounter people who don't understand why Blackness or Black studies might be an important, uh, an important way to approach music, even when the subject matter is Black music. There is sometimes a tendency, um, again, lots of big grain of salt here, but there's sometimes a tendency to assert that the Blackness of Black music is sort of incidental, right? It is, you know, the Blackness of a person who has made a musical contribution is a fact of their experience, but not necessarily something that is rendered in or speaks to their musicality. In other words, there's a push to kind of um, to completely disembody music in a way that also sort of pushes down experiences that are tied to bodies marked as other.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um, and this comes from, if we kind of get philosophical with it, there has been for a long time an idea, especially in Western art music, that music is this ephemeral thing that at its best is disembodied. It goes through bodies, for in order to kind of create sound, right?
Mhm.
But bodies are kind of this imperfect means of, that's necessary for creating the sound. And ideally, we can bypass that altogether, and music is just the sound. Um, Actually, there's a musicologist by the name of Christopher Small, who offered the idea of musicking, right? Music as a practice, as a doing, that is, not disconnected from the people who are making it, and making it, sort of physically making the sound, but making it sort of conceptually. Um, but I think there's a uh, a kind of implicit musicking that happens when we think of something like Black music, Black music as an idea, because that insistence on Blackness means that we need to contend with Blackness as an identity, Blackness as bodies, Blackness as, social constructs,
Uh-huh.
in order to understand this thing that's supposed to be just sound disconnected from embodied experiences. So, uh, so yeah, sometimes there's still that. need to assert that these are interesting framings. This need to point out that Black studies folks have been making musicological discourse for a very long time and often sort of fall by the wayside. Like whenever I teach my intro to African American music course, the first thing my students read is Du Bois, and I'm like, you need to know that from very early on, when people were engaging in this conversation about Black modernity, music was an important part of asserting what that modernity looks like, feels like, sounds like, because music is so often put forward as the best representation of the quintessence of a people.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I think it's sort of keeping those two, balls in the air, like, ensuring that on in both spaces that we make sure that there is this kind of we're pulling in the let's say the critical gifts of each discipline, and together it's just one sort of conversation. Talking about Black music is kind of one conversation, but it's one conversation that's doing different things in different spaces.
That's a really
And yeah.
That's a really great teaser for your book, by the way. This characterization of Black studies and musicology or sound studies. And I love the way you embedded in Du Bois, that this has been a concern. And, for me, I mean, I think about this as not my specialty or my form of writing, but it's an issue, I think, for Black studies that's really essential, which is, what has happened to the way we imagine music, not to music, but
Mm,
the way we imagine music as scholars in its place, whether it's students, because I think what you were saying about the students being sort of surprised, or this is a way of sort of jolting them into the seriousness of the inquiry and an introduction to African
mm,
American music is this questions of modernity, Du Bois and sound. And,
mhm,
as you said, but this is the place of music and the way we think about music historically, as you said, like a kind of quintessential sort of embodiment of a people. Um,
mm,
and I hope and I think this book of yours is going to have a real impact on Black studies, specifically around the stuff with Atlanta, but hopefully also more broadly in terms of how we think about sound. So, and this what the last couple questions, what you've said has really made such a powerful case for this kind of seriousness. I appreciate that a lot.
yeah,
And so let me ask you then, as sort of last question, one of of the two final questions I have for you. And I think you've kind of walked up to a way of thinking about this, a response to this. The first of the last two questions is thinking in a Black studies context, what do you think the field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well historically?
mm. Um, yeah, I really sat with this question, um, because it again, there are many potential directions to go in, but when I first, saw the question, uh, the first thing that came to mind, again, another anecdote, small anecdote, but, in grad school, I had the privilege of being, Manning Marable's research assistant,
Oh, wow.
and, he was just finishing up, Malcolm X: A Life of Reinvention, and he was beginning research on his next book, which, you know, never came to fruition because he unfortunately, passed in that time. But, the working title of that book was Black Radicals and the World They Made, and he wanted to look at all of the people over the past century who were radicals in their time and often dismissed because of their radicalism. They were putting out ideas that the world just kind of saw as so outside of the norm or accepted truths, that they just sort of hung on the fringes, but they pushed the center, and they would wind up reorienting the world, right? Reorienting uh, the things that we take for granted today. You know, one of the questions that he would often sort of throw out in the lead up to his pitch for this book is how did we go from a world that questioned the very humanity of Black people, or not a world, but a world, but specifically a nation that questioned the very humanity of Black people, to a nation that had a Black president. And he argues that it's really the theoretical points that are thrown out there, not thrown out, but that were pushed out into the world, that even in their time, they weren't accepted, but they offered change. And I think that's something that Black Studies has done incredibly. You know, there are so many ideas that I have first encountered in college or in grad school from Black studies that I hear, guiding conversations people are having on TikTok, right?
Mhm.
We really have created a world where the theory of Black studies um, impacts how the truths that we're oriented around, like the truths that we take for granted. And even many people don't necessarily understand, the ways they may not know the exact citation, they may not know what intervention was posed by the idea, but it's been sort of absorbed into the ether. I also think that's one of the reasons why sometimes folks don't necessarily understand the full impact of Black studies, right? Because, it'll be like, well, of course, of course we can, think through, or of course it's necessary sometimes uh, to invite advocacy into your research, especially when there are social ills that are in, that infringe on human rights, but they don't think about the times or they don't necessarily know about the times when that sort of discourse was dismissed altogether as patently not academic, or even like I said, it's happening in conversations on YouTube and TikTok. I, you know, I can't stress enough uh, how how amazing it is to see folks who are very young, teenagers, who are, talking about, intersubjectivity, you know?
Uh-huh.
Uh, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think so. That's something I think that Black Studies has really uh, done so much to create a world that is that has moved beyond the initial circumstances that made Black studies a necessary intervention. Still a lot of work to go. Yeah.
Right.
But uh, one of the things that I hope that we hold on to is that some of that work has been done, that we have moved forward, that there are things that were fought hard for in terms of theory, in terms of ideas, or in terms of interventions that were made that are now we just expect people to have, and we don't have to fight for those anymore. Um, the other side, what are some of the things that have not been as successful? Um, I think this is something that exists within like the arts and the humanities in general. There seems to be this recurring conversation about needing to justify its presence.
Mhm. Mhm.
About convincing people, especially young people, that Black studies has utility, right? That it speaks to, or that we talked about the interdisciplinarity, um, but w- the idea that wherever Black studies goes, and that includes into spaces that are STEM oriented, that it adds a benefit. And this also potentially speaks to a more recent uh, trend where the idea of the college education, especially, um, sometimes gets reduced to its fungibility on the market and the idea that, oh, if I have a certain type of major, a certain type of degree, then that is not as marketable, and I need to make sure that I, have a certain major, regardless of what I'm interested in, regardless of where my skills lie. Um, so I'd say that when I was, looking at colleges for the first time, and um, I remember people having conversations about what can you do with an African American studies major or a Black studies major. This idea that it's kind of self indulgent, that it's not, really relevant, and then you get out into the world and you can't do anything with it. Um, that idea still looms.
Mm,
So I think, and there have certainly been efforts to combat that. But I think something about the persistence of the idea that Black studies is somehow disconnected from from the world in a way that makes it less useful for people who go into it, because it really does discourage folks uh, from going into it. And I'd kind of affix that to other ideas, like, the idea that Black studies only has space for uh, Black people looking inward. Right? You know, um, there is not a space or a field that could not in some way be enhanced by, or helped by, or made more vibrant and more effective. Um, uh, that it can't do that, or that wouldn't benefit from Black studies orientation. I think, we know that within the field. We need to make sure people outside of the field also know that. And I'd add one more thing on there, because sometimes there is, especially if, when we're talking about uh, artistic and political movements, sometimes there's a tendency to hyper focus um, on either oppression or surviving oppression, with not as much space for things like joy or creativity.
mhm,
And, again, these are all, very important parts of a complex and nuanced discussion. It's one of the reasons why I appreciate folks like Kevin Kwashi, who's like talking about Black aliveness, in his book Black Aliveness. Uh, I think that, and this is, I think especially important for somebody, like me, who does and and spaces of jubilation, right? Music in the club, music in parties. That understanding the significance and the power of um, of those moments of joy. And there absolutely have been movements to kind of reclaim that and center that, and to push beyond, um, you know, Black studies as analyzing terrible things that have happened to Black people. Um, but, there's sometimes a tendency to kind of go back there. Um, and again, that's important work. It is, but uh, we have to keep that joy and that creativity and that insistence in mind. I'm gonna drop a quote that I once got from Bettina Love. I don't even know if she remembers telling me this, but it's something that I've really held on to. There's nothing that Black folks have been through where they didn't find time to celebrate.
mhm,
And that there's something very revolutionary about an insistence on celebration uh, when you are navigating a world that sought to reduce you to your labor.
mhm.
Um, so yeah, those are some things that I wish there was a little more of a shift, right? A little, things that we can think about moving forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just a intra podcast comment from early June episode, which we're doing this in early June, but by the time this comes out, it'll be later. Early June episode with Sky Jackson, who's a poet, and this was one of the
Mm-hmm.
things she really emphasized as a poet. That there's a market for, but also a very deep need to tell stories of trauma, loss, and survival. But where is that joy, which is different than pleasure, which is different than, escape, right? But joy, and
Mm-hmm.
you said celebration. I think, quoting Bettina Love. So I think this is a really potent question. And for me, it's interesting in a Black studies context to ask. And I think this is where musicology and musicological dimensions of Black studies can be so important, as well as poets, which is where is the place for that to get its fullest expression. I mean, I think every kind of research connects to that. What would it mean to put this as the center of the experience that we're working with? But I do think
Yeah.
music and poetry have a particular kind of access to that, or particular occasion for reflection and expression of this that is really special. So I'm happy to have it come up again.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd add in there, and I'm so happy that, my thoughts are already in conversation with somebody on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, I think that is, part of what can sometimes get dismissed about, music and the arts, within research spaces, because if it can't be oriented around something that is where the seriousness is unmistakable, then often it's easy to dismiss as, frivolous. Right. So I'm thinking about how important, for instance, gangster rap was to early hip hop studies, right? In part because it's easy to sort of see, not easy, it took some working, but we can see the political dimensions of gangster rap because they're commenting um, on the on a gritty representation of, the fallout of the crack epidemic and, gang wars and histories of social neglect. And that is an important part of what hip hop music does and has done. At the same time that gangster rap was, you know, thriving and sort of at its peak, Miami bass was also having a moment. And, it's playing at a lot of the parties, including, in spaces where gangster rap, was sort of thriving. So, in all of that focus on a particular iteration of hip hop that was, let's say, easier to politicize, we have kind of this twin discourse that doesn't acknowledge, um, at the same time, we're not acknowledging these other types of hip hop that are happening or outright dismissing it because we can't connect it to that sort of politics. And everything sort of in retrospect, I think by now, there are a lot of folks who have reclaimed some of the interventions of music like that. I'm thinking about, the Crunk Feminist Collective offering, ratchet feminism, as a means of understanding uh, certain ways of being and doing that are, let's say, not quite as aligned with respectability, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it's we lose so much if we don't take time to um, also theorize with seriousness, um, moments that are tender, moments that are joyous. Because if there is no space for joy in how we're theorizing or orienting, kind of what are we doing?
Yeah,
you know.
no, that's a legitimate question. And maybe the question, maybe you've already answered this final question, which is, what is thinking in a Black studies context, what is the question you would want us to all be asking, or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about? And if you want to
Mm.
say what I just said, that's perfectly fine.
I mean, I guess that is part of what it said. I guess I will start with when I first got into Black studies. I was convinced that the future of the field would be about post-racial anti-Blackness. I was convinced. because this is, and not to, this is probably, around the 2010s, the beginning of the 2010s. And, I there was so much public discourse about, post-racial America and especially post-racial millennials. Um, and all of this discussion, and I was like, well, that doesn't neutralize the power dynamics of these histories. So, you know, the direction of the field will be discussing the ways that anti-blackness persists in a world that insists that it is post-racial. Anyway, I was wrong. I was wrong. That is not the conversation that we have to happen.
Funny.
That we have to have. Um, so, uh, yeah, I think that really sets up the question that I do have, which, you know, as horrified as I am about the directions that that the nation has gone in, over the past 15 years in terms of the mainstreaming of overt anti-blackness as, a valid political position. Um, I, you know, the scholar in me is like, well, how do we really make sense of that kind of reframing? How has it been, or what's happened such that even people who don't necessarily align with or believe in uh, anti-black stances are accepting certain ideas that are grounded in anti-blackness as truths to be, jumped off of or engaged with. um, I think that this will probably yield a lot of really fruitful work, from existing scholars, future scholars. I'm really curious about the forthcoming work from people who are uh, navigating childhood in this time.
Yeah.
What is that orientation? And I'll say one other thing, and this is a thing that I definitely did say earlier, but I think it bears repeating. Uh, as somebody who does work in music, so often the idea of music is kind of tied to, if you're going to study it, um, you have to kind of assert its value in a certain way. You have to say that this has artistic value for these specific reasons. And if somebody is relating to that music and to a style of music that doesn't necessarily fit a frame for greatness, it doesn't have to be the same frame of greatness, but if we can't, you know, sort of take that frame for greatness, then our knee-jerk reaction is often to say that something's wrong with these people,
Uh-huh.
right? And that comes up a lot. Um, it comes up a lot in popular music studies, especially. Uh, but I think, again, the question that we should lead with is, what's this doing and for who? Right. Because if there's a style of music or a style of art or anything that people are identifying with and they're gravitating toward and it's doing important work for them, um, the, you know, for starters, dismissing the music that they are self-identifying with and doing self-making work with, that is a tried and true means of dismissing the people that music represents.
Uh-huh.
And that has been written all over, very long histories of anti-black stances uh, on music. It's usually just a stone's throw away from just regular old anti-blackness.
Uh-huh.
But but getting to that question and allowing space for people to articulate that why. It's a thing that I try to do in my class. Um, I will say I feel like sometimes a lot of students will try to say things about the music they think I like, and not necessarily, which I appreciate it. But they have experiences with music and affinities for music that um, experiences that I don't have, orientations I don't have, and I usually try at some point in the semester to ask them, you know, well, what music? makes up your soundtrack? You know, what music is doing work for you? And to sit with the question of why, even if they don't have an answer, you know, over the course of the semester, I want them to struggle or to sort of wrestle with the idea of what's this music doing for me? How does it connect to me? How do I feel represented by it? Um, because if we keep that question in mind, it expands um, it expands how we understand the humanity of the people around us, and also, you know, it's a more interesting question about than whether or not I like the music. So,
Yes.
you know, right, you know, beyond how I value the music aesthetically, beyond whether or not I play it in my headphones, the knowledge that people are doing new things with music and they are sort of building their own perspectives and building new futures, like, that is really exciting work, and we've seen it in the past that, you know, people who are jazz oriented have laid the foundations for, new perspectives on thinking, new ways of marking society. Hip hop studies absolutely did that. You know, there's just, or even, you know, back earlier, we can think about, Amiri Baraka, blues people, right? So that's, I think, the question that I want to keep asking and keep in our present. You know, like, what is the you know, people are gravitating toward different things. You know, what's that about? You know, before we value it, you know, before we say whether or not it sort of tackles that visceral discomfort.
Uh-huh.
You know, trying to understand what is it about these novel interventions in music? What is it about it that's drawing folks in? I had a lot of fun having conversations about that with mumble rap.
Thank you so much. This was I love that as something to take away from this podcast, which is from this episode, which is so much about thinking really hard about the things that animate us, right? In terms of joy, but
Mhm.
also in terms of thoughtfulness. And, that, you brought it back to this series of questions or sort of sites of reflection that have really been central to everything you've said in this conversation, which this is a fantastic contribution to the series, Kevin. I really appreciate your time, but your thoughtfulness and your insight is really, really appreciated and really is going to uh, be a unique and important contribution to the Black Studies podcast. So thank you so much for all of that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This has been an amazing conversation, and I feel so privileged to be a part of the conversation that you are curating here. So thank you.
Well, we're lucky to have you on it. So, well, have a great rest of your day and good luck with the book launch. This will come out around, the time that the ebook comes out. So, nothing like having a book come out, showing up in physical form and all that hard work. So, congratulations. And yeah, have a great rest of your Tuesday.
All right. Thank you. You do the same.
All right. Bye bye.